Recently, there were a handful of articles which were published which discussed a short scene that was deleted from Toy Story 2. The scene was part of a series of, I guess you could call them, fake bloopers that was at the end of the movie, and there were many articles which were connecting the deletion of this scene with the metoo movement. So here's a brief look at the part that got removed, and then I'll share some thoughts on it after.
Bullseye, are you with me? Okay. Good boy. Prospector, how about you?
And so you two are absolutely identical? I'm sure I could get you a part in Toy Story 3.
I'm sorry, are we back?
Oh, all right, girls. Lovely talking with you. Yes, anytime you'd like some tips on acting, I'd be glad to chat with you. All right, off you go then.
So the obvious questions which arise are, why did this happen? Why was this scene removed? And whether or not it should have been removed. And technically, it's a bit hard to know. According to an article that I read by the LA Times, there wasn't really much of an explanation given for, the deletion of this scene. And so in this video, I'd like to at least offer some reasons both for and against this decision and, sort of lay out, some of the different reasons for why people may support or object to it. I'd also like to touch on some of the broader issues that it's connected with, because, in a sense, this is a relatively trivial thing, but I do think that it is related to some deeper issues and some problems that are worth considering. So to begin with, what are some potential criticisms that people may have for the deletion of this scene? And I suppose one objection is that the scene is more or less harmless. It's a trivial kind of a thing, and because of that, there's no need to remove it. And to sort of get a sense of where this perspective is coming from, you can ask a number of questions, what's the impact of this clip? Will it cause, perhaps men to objectify women? Will it cause more sexual assault or sexual harassment to occur? And I suppose you could even consider the counterfactual. Let's suppose that this scene had never been produced. Let's assume that this scene had never been seen by anyone. Would there be any, sexual assaults or cases of sexual harassment which would have been prevented by this scene's removal? And basically what these types of questions are getting at is, what is the real world impact of this scene? And, many would I suppose argue that, again, it's a trivial kind of a thing. It's relatively inconsequential, and, nobody is going to go out and rape someone because, they saw Stinky Pete flirting with some Barbies in a blooper scene on Toy Story 2. Something like that. Granted, it is kind of hard to, assess these claims. It's hard to know, the counterfactual world where this scene didn't exist in Toy Story 2, but that's a general, at least, point that some people may make. Again, this is relatively inconsequential. Another objection may be that, people need to lighten up a little bit. It's just a joke. It's just some humor. You have an old guy who thinks that some, young female actresses are hot. This isn't anything that's that big of a deal. And perhaps they may even push this further and say that, people are getting too sensitive when it comes to humor. People should be allowed to laugh about things. And, we're kind of moving in a direction as a society that's sort of losing our ability to have a sense of humor. Another objection that could be made, and one that I actually think is perhaps the most interesting, is that we can ask, what does this apply logically? In other words, if we're going to sort of take this way of thinking to its logical conclusion, what does it mean for how we should interact with other movies that have been made, or perhaps other songs that have been written? And it raises sort of the interesting issue of, do we go back and remove and change or delete, everything from the past, which we now understand or deem to be wrong? And some may say that, that this isn't the right approach to have. While it's true that mistakes have been made in the past, and while it's true that we should learn from these mistakes, we don't necessarily have to go back and abolish everything that used to exist, which we now deem to be, again, morally objectionable. And this critique sort of, I guess you could say, it examines or it tries to get at why this scene might have been removed. And then it asks, do we really want to consistently apply this standard across the board? Is it really a reasonable approach that, we should implement when dealing with our past mistakes? So those are a handful of reasons why some may object to it. Again, it's not that big of a deal. People need to lighten up with the humor. It's just a joke. And then we can ask, is this really a standard that we're going to consistently apply across the board? On the other hand, there are other reasons that people may offer in defense of the removal of this scene. I suppose to begin with, it's people should probably note that it's not an important part of the storyline. It's just a relatively random clip at the end. It doesn't impact the story in any way, or rather, I should say, deleting it doesn't really impact the story in any way. With that said, though, others may highlight the fact that this is a relatively inappropriate joke. I mean, when you watch the clip, you can see him telling them that he can get these Barbies a spot in Toy Story 3, and it seems reasonable to assume, based upon how he acts, that what's driving him is primarily the fact that he thinks that they're physically attractive and not really due to any talent that they have. I mean, again, I don't mean to read too much into this. Again, it's just a little scene in a make-believe in a fictional story, but there's a sense in which especially when you look at the way he's talking to them, you can look at how he looks at them and sort of checks them out as he walks away. And I could see how some may look at this and say, this is somewhat objectifying. It's a bit superficial, perhaps a bit derogatory. Perhaps it sort of reflects a mindset that has a tendency to value women in terms of how they look. I could see how someone could argue along those lines. And I could also see how someone may say, look, sure, people may joke about this, but this is a children's movie, and should jokes like this really be made when you have a target audience that's aimed at people who are very young? A third point, and this is perhaps the most significant, and this is one that kind of got picked up quite a bit in a number of articles that discuss this topic, is that there may be a bit more to this scene than meets the eye of the average person. And I know, some of the things I'm going to discuss certainly didn't cross my mind when I watched this scene as a younger person. There definitely was a sense in which I was a little bit naive, as a young kid watching it. And part of this stems from, there was a phrase that arose in a number of articles. They use this phrase, casting couch. And this refers to when sexual favors are given in return for either a job or some type of promotion or some type of workplace benefit. And although the scene didn't explicitly show this occurring, there's a sense in which what happened was sort of indicative of this sort of, I guess you could say, behind the scenes interaction that does seem to occur, at least from time to time. And again, to the average person, this may not necessarily be particularly obvious, but perhaps to someone who's more familiar or more aware of the inner workings of this industry, the connection may be a bit more obvious. And so there are a handful of objections that can arise both to this practice and to sort of some of the issues that are connected to it. The first off would obviously be that it's offering jobs or it's offering promotions based, at least in part, on one's willingness to engage in sexual activity. And of course, the obvious objection here is that, one's willingness to engage in sexual activity should play no role in whether or not they get a job or whether or not they get a promotion. Rather, it's their character and the skills that they bring to the table, which should be the primary determining factors. And so, engaging in this sort of casting couch type of an activity sort of violates the standards which we ought to have for determining who should and should not get hired and or promoted. A second point that we could probably bring up is that this type of a scenario can put people in a very uncomfortable, perhaps threatening, and somewhat vulnerable position. It may put people in a spot where perhaps they feel like they have to compromise themselves in an unfair way in order to get a job or a promotion. They perhaps may need to compromise certain values that they have in order to succeed. And they may even be concerned that if they turn down offers or if they turn down certain sexual advances, perhaps they may suffer certain ramifications. Perhaps they'll lose the promotion. Perhaps they will, perhaps in a worst case scenario, even get fired for it. So you can sort of see how this sort of a climate where you have sort of an unequal distribution of power, where you have a boss who's making certain sexual advances, can put the worker or the person who's trying to get hired in a very uncomfortable and relatively vulnerable situation. A third point, and this isn't directly related, but I think it's at least worth mentioning, is that this type of an activity sort of instills this idea that there are some people who sleep their way to the top. And what we mean by this is that, the success that they have is viewed more so as a result of who they've slept with rather than because of their talent. And this type of an attitude can end up harming people, or I guess you could say, it could end up harming people who genuinely have worked hard and put a lot of effort into their success. And it may shed unnecessary doubt on those who genuinely have worked hard, and it can sort of undermine again the talent that people have and the sacrifices that they have made to get to where they have, or to get to where they are. A fourth point, and perhaps this is the one that's most salient in our society today, especially in this sort of metoo era that we live in, is that this is very much connected with a severe abuse of power. And this sort of stems from the idea that someone who's in authority can use the fact that they have the power to hire someone or to give them a promotion. They can basically use that in order to coerce sex out of that person. And in so doing, they basically can exploit this person's need for a job or their desire to have a promotion. They can basically exploit that in order to get sexual favors out of them. And in many cases, the victims of this are going to be people who are younger, people who lack experience, people who sort of need the help of others in order to progress in their careers. So they're in a relatively vulnerable position. And there may even be other instances in which the person who's in power may actually engage in sexual assault or sexual harassment. And again, the victims may be in a very vulnerable situation. They may not feel comfortable coming forward and speaking out, perhaps out of fear of the ramifications. Perhaps they'll be punished. Perhaps they'll lose the promotion. Perhaps they may even lose the job. They may even get blacklisted and have a harder time, getting other jobs because of their decision to come forward and share their experiences. So, those are some of the problems with, again, this sort of casting couch culture and some of the issues that are related to it. So, again, that's sort of a very brief overview of some ways of thinking about reasons why one might object to the removal of this scene. It might also offer people a sense of why the scene was removed and give people perhaps a broader context for understanding why the scene might be objectionable. And, I think that in a sense, the fact that we're having this conversation, the fact that we are discussing these things, and the fact that this even occurred, that the scene was even deleted, does show that things have changed. And I do think that it is fair to attribute at least a part of this to the Me Too movement. Again, there is a sense in which this scene is, relatively speaking, inconsequential when you look at a lot of the other problems that are going on in the world. But at the same time, I do think that there is a degree of symbolism in the removal of this scene. I think that it is perhaps to some extent a sign of a growing sensitivity, or perhaps a signal of a growing awareness of a problem that has existed. Perhaps to some extent it may even be an acknowledgement that this scene is perhaps in some ways sort of connected with a sort of darker realm, so to speak, where there has been a massive abuse of power, and this has only relatively recently been honestly reconciled with, or at least reconciled with to a greater extent than it has been in the past. And I think in a limited way, this scene sort of reflects the reality or some of the challenges and some of the abuses that many people, I would assume it's predominantly women, have had to deal with, in relatively extreme forms. I mean, the scene is, in a sense, relatively innocent compared to a lot of the stories that we've heard, but we have to remember that, again, there have been some genuine cases that have caused us to be concerned about whether or not, there are some severe abuses of power that are going on behind the scenes. And again, I think the extent to which, the Me Too movement has made people more aware of this, and the fact that, a company like Disney would remove a scene like this, I think that awareness is a good thing, again, on the whole. I mean, granted, the Me Too movement has given rise to a lot of controversy. There are a lot of criticisms against it, but again, I think the extent to which it's shed some light on some of the things that have gone on behind the scenes is a good aspect of it. Again, we can debate over the specifics of whether or not the scene should have been removed. We can, question whether or not, this is a reasonable way to deal with faults in the past. But I think that, again, on the whole, at least the fact that we're having this conversation is a good thing. And, people may differ on how exactly we move forward. But on the whole, I think that this is at least a step in the right direction, regardless of whether or not this specific decision to remove the scene was the right one, or whether or not this is a plausible way for us to sort of deal with some of the mistakes that we've made in the past. So, that's pretty much it for this video. Again, a relatively trivial act, but hopefully, it's at least giving people some food for thought and giving people a sense of perhaps some of the broader issues that are connected with something as small as, a scene that's being deleted from a children's movie. So, with that said, again, hopefully this gave you something to think about. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.